I just want to say thank you to Jeffrey Richardson for inviting me to participate in this wonderful conversation with you all today about something I love doing, and that is building relationships. It's one of my favorite things to do and one of my favorite things to talk about. So hopefully during this course of this presentation about within your reach, I'll say something that resonates with you that you think that you can use in your everyday life as a practical tip, or maybe I'll say something that reminds you of something you already know that maybe you want to tell someone else, because the folks that you want to connect with and the things that you want to do in life are certainly within your reach. A bit about me that Jeffrey has already sort of talked about, but I'll frame it in a different way. I am pleased to have been living in Washington, D.C. for the last 20 years of my life. And while being in Washington, D.C., I've been able to weave together personal and professional networks that have allowed me to do a lot of really cool and interesting things, using all the tools in the public affairs toolbox to help make the lives of individuals and families and communities, and even so far as our country, a little bit better and more equitable. So it's been a fantastic journey, and a journey that has no doubt been stitched together really not only by like what I'm able to do and what I bring, but really by the folks that I've had the ability to connect with over time. And those folks who become my, personal and professional networks who have been made a big impact on my life. And that's why I love to talk to people about practical ways in which they can continue to help build out and expand their network and deepen relationships that they have with people. So today we're going to talk about it within the context of three different things: reaching in, reaching out, and reaching your full potential. The reaching in is going to be about the internal stuff that you have to do, or that I encourage and invite you to do before you go out into the world to do networking and relationship building. But reaching out is going to be about some practical tips that I think are really helpful, particularly during these times when we are not able to meet and see each other in person. And then reaching full potential are going to be some of my, what I, to borrow the words of DJ Khaled, major keys about the whole idea and premise of building relationships that last and relationships that you can leverage. So our ground rules for today, I know that even though we're gathering in a virtual setting, in a virtual sense, we still have to have a couple of rules, even though they're typically made to be broken. Be present. I'm going to ask that although we're here on Zoom and you might experience Zoom fatigue, to try to be as present as much as possible. But I also encourage you to follow the advice of the 20-20-20 rule. And if you're not familiar with that, I hope that that is something that you will incorporate in your daily life, especially during all these Zooms and web conferences and all that kind of stuff. And so the 20-20-20 is every 20 minutes, if you can, look 20 feet away for about 20 seconds. And that'll help rest your eyes and help you with the fatigue of looking at the same screen all the time. So 20-20-20, first thing you'll learn during this. Do that if you can. Chat away. As Jeffrey talked about, the chat box is open, and I am interested in having some sort of bi-directional dialogue with you. That's exciting. And the final rule is, if you feel like it, be social. So a lot of times when I am in meetings, and sometimes when I'm at conferences and events, if I hear something that I like, I love to send it out to folks via, whether that's on Twitter, or on Facebook or LinkedIn. If I hear something, I want to hear something good, I want to share it with the folks within my network. So feel free to share away if you hear something that resonates with you. But first, right, Oprah's one of my favorite people, and she asks some of the best questions, and I think we all can learn from that. So if, again, use the chat box and you can say what you want to hear, and I can kind of keep my eye on that chat box, and if I see something there that I don't have already woven into this presentation, I'll try to make sure that I do it by the end of this presentation. So what do you want to hear about today? let me know so that we can make sure that we cover some of that ground. Reaching in, right? So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the show Insecure, but it's one of my favorite shows on HBO. And a lot of times the central character, Issa, has conversations in the mirror with herself. And sometimes she's looking in the mirror and she sees the person that she is. And sometimes she's in the mirror and she sees the person she doesn't want to be. And sometimes she sees the person who she wants to become. And I think it's really interesting when people think about relationship building. They immediately go to you talking to someone else rather than you having a little self-talk and understanding with yourself. And I think it's essential that when you think about your relationship building during this time period, that you start with making sure you have a firm relationship and an understanding of who you are so that you're able to help clearly define, what it is that you're seeking or what types of new relationships that you're trying to build. It's also helpful for you to do some of that internal introspective work. So thinking about who are you as a person, who are you as a professional, who are you during these times, right? What drives you, what motivates you? Because when you're reaching out and getting to know people, you need to be able to articulate those things to others, right? Another person can't have a better understanding of you than you can have of yourself. And to be an advocate for yourself, to build authentic relationships, people need to know who you are. And so it's important for you to know who you are, and who you are trying to become. And the other part about doing some internal introspective work is why, right? So why are you trying to reach out and build new relationships? And that why is going to also be a driving factor in some of these next steps of reaching out, right? If your why is you want to build relationships because you want to get employment at an academic institution, right? When you're thinking about who you are and what you bring to the world, those things need, and how you articulate who you are to other people, it needs to be in alignment, right? Or if you're looking for a job after you've done your graduate studies, then the language you use needs to also be in alignment with I am job hunting. So just figuring out, again, some introspection, asking yourself, who am I? Why do I want to network? What is my sort of purpose around this? And some questions that I'll invite you to think about during this time. Well, before I give you the questions, I'll talk a little bit more about the idea of exposition and position. So you all in graduate school, exposition is the whole part of you exploring, right? Exploring what is your story, what is the story that you want to tell. You are the central character, but like, what's the beginning and the end? What did your character learn? What should people know about your character? That's the exposition part. The positioning part is figuring out how do then you market yourself, right? And tell that story in a way that is compelling to the audience of people that you want to be talking to yourself about, right? So it's like, again, first step, figuring out who I am, figuring out what I'm doing, where I'm trying to go, great. And then positioning yourself, figuring out how do you tell that story about who you are, what it is that you're trying to do, where you're trying to go, using the language that will help better position you for that thing that you want to do next. So thinking about exposition and positioning. And here are some of the questions that I always encourage folks to consider. Where are you, right? And not just about where are you, but why did you choose that place? How is that central to your current story? And how does that relate to the place that you're trying to go? What have you done there? And I encourage you to think about that, as early on as possible. One thing that I like to do is sort of keep a monthly sort of list of the things that I've worked on, right? So that at the end of a professional journey or academic journey, I can go back to, those 8 or 9 sheets of paper if I've written them down, or I can go back and look at that spreadsheet in Google Docs, wherever I put it. And I can say, okay, these are the things that I've done here. And on one hand, they're going to be helpful when you're trying to figure out how do you update your CV. But on the other hand, you're going to be able to look at those things and see themes about the types of work that you did, probably be reminded of things that you did that you had forgotten about. And you can think about how do those actual tasks and then how do those themes, how are you going to be able to articulate those when you're doing networking and you're just talking about yourself in general when you're encountering people. So, think of what have you done? What did you learn? What was the impact? People really love impact now. Like, what was the impact? And not just the impact on, let's say, the work that you were doing, but I invite you to go deeper and say, like, what was the impact of the work that I did on me? Because that will also be helpful in you sort of figuring out your own next steps and then also communicating about it. Was there something super promising or challenging that you worked on? How did you grow, right? Did it prepare you for what's next? And, centrally, core question is, what is next? And then how do you articulate this in plain language? And I will use a very good friend of mine as an example about some exposition and position work that I've helped coach someone on recently. My buddy, who is awesome, not so long ago, got his PhD in public health. And he came to me and he said, this is my story. This is what I'm telling people when I'm talking to them, but I'm not getting much traction. And I said, well, that's because most of the people that you're talking to don't also have a PhD in public health. So you need to break down those ideas. You need to break down what you were doing in some plain language to help better give people opportunity to understand what you were doing and the impact that you had, because they're not going to understand sort of the jargon that he had gotten himself caught up in when he was talking about himself and the work that he had previously done. So I think it's really important that we, think about that. One, for folks who have maybe specialized in a certain area and are accustomed to talking to people who already know all the same language that you're using. And two, if you're looking to move, particularly in something into a different area that people wouldn't immediately think that like someone with your academic or professional background would be interested in or have skills to do. We have to be able to really articulate why using their language, right? Why the work that you did, why what you have studied is applicable to them. So that's some about that exposition and position piece, because you want to position yourself as best as possible. Reaching out. You'll notice I have a lot of photos in my slideshow because I like pop culture. And so there's Idris Elba, who in one of his roles as an investigative reporter, right? He was reaching out, trying to leave no stone unturned. So during this process of finishing up graduate school and figuring out what's next, I hope and I can see you've demonstrated today that you're using some of your traditional ways of connecting. So like, the career center, the organizations that you're a part of, like all those things that everyone instinctively knows, like, oh, I should, those things that you should do and those people that you think you should reach out to. My whole thing is like, leave no stone unturned, because often the person who leads you to your next thing is someone who's considered a loose tie, right? So it's not someone who's in your immediate social and professional bubble. Oftentimes your loose ties are the people who can lead you to that next thing, because they don't talk to the same people that you always talk to. They're not necessarily reading everything that you always read. And so they just have a different flow of information, and they might be able to help connect you in a different way. So I encourage folks to really think about that broadly when you're thinking about your current network as it already exists. Don't just think about the same old 5 people that you talk to all the time. Think about all the folks who are in your network. And so a couple of those buckets, I want you to think about those individuals. And when I think about individuals, I'm not, again, not just your current professors. Also think about like, oh, my aunt or my uncle or my cousin who lives in Fresno. Really expanding that idea and not just saying like, oh, my current professor, but like, what about someone from undergrad, right, that you talk to who might be helpful, because you know that that person has a large network. But really being creative about that, leave no stone unturned. school organizations and affiliations, I think often go overlooked. Sometimes when we're in undergrad and grad school, like we're part of these really awesome organizations, we're doing great work, but we don't necessarily think about how to reach back into that same pool of folks and alumni of those organizations as people that we can connect with on that sort of professional level who might be able to help us get to that next step. And when I think about organizations, I mean all of the organizations that you're a part of, right? Not just the ones who are centrally focused on, what your subject matter expertise might be or what you're studying, right? If you're a member of other organizations with different, cover a range of different diverse topics, think if you're part of that organization, there's probably someone else who is like-minded in that organization who might be able to connect you to something else that you're interested in, right? So thinking about that diverse. I also tell folks to don't forget about your faith communities that you might be a part of, because, there are folks there too. So literally leave no stone unturned. And you can use sort of these 3 buckets to do it as like a homework assignment. Go through and say like, okay, what organizations am I a part of? Have I been a part of? Which organizations am I a part of that might have alumni organizations or have listservs that could be helpful, but like doing a deep dive, not shallow, but going deep as possible in all 3 of those buckets. And okay, so we talked about reaching in, and now we're going to continue talking about, the reaching out part. And when we think about reaching out, I'm saying, a couple things. Got to be solid, you got to be systematic. So when I talk about the solid piece, that goes back to some of the work that you've already done, right? You've already started doing some asking yourself some questions about who you are, where it is that you want to go, how you see yourself in the future, right? Because the more you think about that, and the more you talk about that and practice talking about it, you get better at it and you have some real solid sort of messaging. I am someone that people send my way all the time. They're like, oh, Clarence knows a lot of people. He might be able to connect you to someone, blah, blah, blah. And that is true. But if someone comes to me and they don't have a solid, I'm going to say, tell me about yourself. If they don't have a solid answer for that, if they don't have a solid answer for like, tell me the 3 buckets of places or things that you're interested in doing, I can't help you because you haven't given me the information to help you, right? So think about that when you're, reaching out to folks and talking to people. Do you have a solid narrative that you want to share? Have you honed in on the, maybe 2 or 3 types of positions or 2 or 3 fields or whatever it is, right? You don't have to be super specific and get yourself, and put into a box, but you need to have like a couple of things that you're very solid on that like, I'm interested in A, B, and C, right? Having a solid response for that. Making sure that like your basic minimum social presence is solid. If I go to your LinkedIn page and it still says that you're an undergrad or you're still working at the place you worked at 2 years ago, that is not solid, right? I want you to be solid about how you articulate yourself and solid that like, if I need you, and like the little picture says, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready, right? So you're practicing your elevator speech, you're practicing how you're talking about yourself, you're making sure that your CV is already up to date. So if I say like, oh, well, send me your CV, within the next 10 or 15 minutes, I got someone to pass it off to, you're not trying to fix your CV during the, in 10 minutes so you can pass it to me in 15. Just making sure that all those things are together. That's what I mean by solid. And then systematic outreach is important too. So one of my favorite career coaches is a guy named Michael Melcher, based out of New York. Google him, he's awesome. And he talks about this idea that we spend all of our workday working, right? Because we think that that is our career, like our career is to do the work. Well, he posits that actually you should spend at least 20 minutes a day working on your career, right? So not just like 20 minutes a day, doing additional work. You should be spending 20 minutes a day working on your career. And that, could mean that you're going to spend, 20 minutes every day reading some professional development. That could be that you're going to spend 20 minutes a day, doing active outreach and networking. Making sure that you're systematic about working on your career is super important because your career is important. And there's the African proverb that says, only brush the teeth that you want to keep. I'll say that again. Only brush the teeth that you want to keep, right? And so if relationship building is important, that's a tooth you want to keep, you need to brush it, right? And you need to sit down and say, maybe once a month or once a week, part of my professional development, working on my career is going to be, I'm going to send out emails, or I'm going to schedule coffees on Mondays and Wednesdays. Whatever it is, making sure that you're being active about it and that you're being systematic about it. A few slides ago, we talked about like those 3 different buckets of people that you could perhaps be reaching out to. Maybe you want to say like, on the first, I'll spend I'll spend October reaching out to my individual connections. In November, I'll be reaching out to people I know through professional affiliations and organizations. December, so like just making sure that you have developed a system that you're going to use to make sure that you're doing the outreach that is necessary to continue to help building and nurturing the network that you have. Being solid and systematic about it. Now, reaching out, this slide, I'm going to cover a lot of things. So there's going to be practical tips in your relationship building. And I'll start at the bottom and go to the top. At the bottom there, you see podcasts. I think today is actually International Podcast Day. Woo woo, shout out to podcasts. We love them. Hopefully, maybe you'll share some of your favorites with me. But podcasts, a lot of people listen to them. Right? And we listen to them for enjoyment and enlightenment, but we can also use podcasts as opportunities to do some outreach. And the 2 ways that you can do outreach and build out your network or help strengthen your network through the use of podcasts are the following. 1, low stakes game is you listen to a podcast, this week about a topic, and you're like, this is super interesting. Make sure you send that same podcast to your people in your network who you think are also interested in that, right? And so that's when people always think like, oh, networking is such a bad thing. You're asking people for stuff. No, you're building relationships. And so part of that building relationship is that like when you hear something on a podcast or a podcast episode that you think is really cool, you're not hoarding it for yourself. You're sending it out to other people who are like-minded, who you think can also get value from listening to the podcast. So that's on the low bar of like how you can use podcasts in your outreach, right? Because people are going to appreciate that you thought about them to send them a podcast where they can get some more information. And it's going to keep you at the top of someone's mind and radar, like, oh, this person, just inboxed me. I should be thinking about this person, right? So that's low hanging fruit. Is like, are you sending out the good podcast info that you hear to other people? Next level of podcast stuff, which I think is really cool, right? If you listen to a podcast or know of a podcast on a topic that you're a subject matter expert on, or that you have a really good opinion about some of the stuff they discuss, reach out to that podcaster and say, hey, I'd like to be on your podcast. Okay, all they can tell you is yes or no. And you're an awesome individual. If they tell you no, that's fine. You're still an awesome individual. But being on a podcast will give you an opportunity to have other people hear your voice about this particular issue and help to kind of build your brand. And maybe someone listening to it will be like, hey, I heard what Maria said on that podcast. I need to reach out to her. She's someone I want to follow. She's someone I want to know about, someone I want to connect to. It also, if being a guest on a podcast will give you something that you can then use in further networking, right? Or similar to a writer, right? Like people are like, oh, I was published in this, I was published in that. Let me send you this, right? Or people want to see some past evidence of you being a subject matter expert, being on the podcast could be a part of that, right? So it's also building your CV, but also building out your relationships. So those are like the very minimum. When you hear a good one, pass it on to someone. If you hear or are frequently listening to one that you think you have something to offer, reach out and say, hey, I want to be on your podcast. If you really want to take it to the next level, I'd say if you have the time, start your own podcast. That doesn't mean that you have to do like, I'm going to do one every day for the next 52 weeks. Nope. It could just be about a topic that you're interested in. Maybe something that maybe it's the same topic of your thesis. Maybe it's the same topic of a dissertation you're planning to write, and say that I'm going to do a 3 or 4 part limited series on this, right? Because it'll give you an opportunity to get your voice out there. But what I really like about it is that it gives you a hook to introduce yourself to someone new by inviting someone else who might be a subject matter expert onto your podcast for you to interview them. And then it becomes a natural way for you to get to introduce yourself to someone and get to know them, and then be able to start building out a relationship. A really good friend of mine has a podcast where she interviews by Indigenous people of color who talk about world affairs, because she's really interested in international relations, and everything that she typically reads or would hear was always from the perspective of like white cis hetero men talking about international affairs. And she was like, but that's not what the world looks like. So she started her own podcast, and she then used it also as a way to help further her career, because it's her way of introducing herself to people who then she has relationships with, who can refer her for different speaking opportunities and different gigs. So that's podcast. The next thing on this slide you see is from one of my alma maters. It's the cover of our alumni magazine that I actually read. Guess what? A lot of other folks are reading your alumni magazine. Your alumni magazine from your undergraduate and graduate institutions is a tool you should be using, okay? There are typically lots of gems inside of that thing. One of them, right, is they typically like list like, you know, Clarence Fluker, class of 2001, just did this. And then I'm like, oh, that's super cool. I'm gonna reach out to Clarence Fluker because I'm an alumni of the same institution, and that's my way to introduce myself and say, hey, can I have maybe 15 or 20 minutes of your time to learn more about what you do? I've read about you in the alumni magazine and it was really cool, right? Because you're using your alumni status at that institution as a way to be your initial connecting piece, and then be able to build off of there. Another thing that they typically have in alumni magazines, right, are opportunities for alumni to write, right? So are you writing about something or thinking about something that you think would be a good fit for you as a subject that you think other alumni should know about, or that your institution could be talking about? You reach out to your alumni affairs office and say, what's the policy or procedures about writing a piece? Because you want that opportunity to get in front, well, to one, talk about something important, and then two, get in front, you know, the eyes of 20, 30,000 other alumni who are going to be looking at that magazine, or on your alumni's website, right? The third thing that they'll often feature in some of these alumni magazines is just like spotlights on people who are doing great things. You know, go back and look and say, hey, and typically I found in both my undergraduate and graduate alumni magazines that there's usually like some email address. I'm like, hey, would you like to be featured or spotlighted? Sure would. I would like to be spotlighted in the alumni magazine, because again, another opportunity for me to get in front of people, for people to hopefully reach out to me because I've said something or done something that they are interested in, and just continue to build out the network of like-minded people. So don't sleep on your alumni magazine, because it is woke, right? And people are reading it, and you should be too. And then the other sort of big category we have on this slide is, you know, all those social media things, right? Social media, you know, can be used for both good and evil, right? Sort of like a boyfriend. They could be really good or really bad, and some days they could be both, right? So it's depending on how you use them. And they can be used for networking. And so the 6 that I have up here I'll give you a couple examples of how you might think about using them for outreach. Um, so Facebook and Instagram, I'll start with those. Facebook and Instagram, particularly at this stage and sort of thinking about what's next for you, could be a great way for you to tell your story and put it out there so that maybe some of those loose ties who you're connected to from maybe undergrad or high school or people who just live down the street from you can get a good, nice sort of snapshot update of what's going on with you, and you can offer them an invitation to help. The example I'll give is a good friend did this a couple years ago, and then I did the same thing 2 years ago too. I knew that my time at the place that I was working was going to be coming to an end in about 2 or 3 months, right? I had the luxury of knowing in 2 or 3 months this job is going to end, and I'm not really sure what I'm going to do next. So I took a couple of great photos that I had taken during the course of my time in that job, right? So make a lovely little collage of some of my high, wonderful moments in the gig. And then I wrote a little something about it. And I said, the last, 2 years have been exceptional. I've had an then I talked about some of those things from the exposition and positioning slide I showed you. I had a wonderful opportunity to learn about this, this, and this while doing this and making this kind of impact. And I know that this time is coming to an end, and I'm trying to figure out what are my next steps. I'm looking for people who want to have coffee with me or set up a virtual coffee date to talk about the next steps. If you've got ideas, let me know. Cleaned up on coffee invites and inbox messages from that thing, right? Because people were like, oh, because one, most people in your personal life don't know all of the things that you're doing at your work life, right? So people are fascinated by that. People have a better understanding now, so they can probably go do a better job of going out and talking about you. I gave them cool visuals. It didn't seem like, hey, I'm looking for a job, right? It didn't just say, hey, I'm looking for a job, email me if you have any leads. Nope. I gave you a story. I gave you a little information about what I had done, what I was thinking about maybe doing, the impact that it had. And then I invited you to have a conversation, right? Like, I love your ideas. So think about what kind of fun framing you can do with some photos that you have from your academic and professional experiences. A little story you could tell and put on your Instagram or your Facebook and invite, your Nana and whomever else to reach out to you, because someone's probably going to have a good idea, and someone's definitely going to have an idea for you that you probably didn't think of yourself. Someone is also probably going to read that and think like, oh, I know someone they should talk to. So thinking about Instagram and Facebook in those ways, it doesn't have to be like your forward-facing, ongoing professional thing, but use them as tools to help build relationships, because the other thing is your friends and family, they want to support you, they're rooting for you, and sometimes they just don't know what you're doing. So give them that information. Twitter is something that I like to use typically when I attend in-person conferences and events. And now I've switched over, of course, to like webinars and Zooms like the rest of the world because of the pandemic. Twitter is awesome for meeting people, right? And for being a part of the conversation. Like any event or webinar that I participate in, I'm going to ask, what is the hashtag, right, for this? Because I want to talk about this. And then I also want to follow the hashtag and see who else is also engaged in that. And if folks are saying things that I'm interested in in-person situations, it was good because if I was attending a conference and I knew that I could, and they have concurrent sessions, and I could only, of course, be one place at one time, I'm following the hashtag for the conference so I can still keep up with what might be being said in that other room. And then if someone in that other room is tweeting stuff that I'm like, oh yeah, I believe in that, that's what I'm thinking too, I immediately reach out to that person and say, hey, I'm attending the same conference on the break. Would you like to meet in the lobby, or would you like to meet in front of that room? I'd love to know more about your thoughts and just learn more about you. People love to talk about themselves. right? It's not like, hey, I want you to give me a job, or hey, I want to, no, it's just like, I want to learn more about you. And so I use Twitter for that. And I think that that's something that you can still do in this virtual world, right? It's like when you're attending things like this, or conferences that have now been turned into virtual experiences, follow those hashtags, see who else is virtually there, and be okay with reaching out to those people and saying like, hey, I see that we're at the same conference. Hey, I see that we're in the same session. And I've read your LinkedIn bio and, your bio, and, would love to connect. Would you be open to that? And you'd be surprised. Most people absolutely are. And it's an opportunity for you to connect with people, and sometimes just also get more followers, right? Because there are also people who are not necessarily participating, but who may be like, who may just be scrolling through Twitter and seeing the hashtag and following you, and they want to connect. Snapchat, right? For the folks who still have it, or still using it, thinking about how do you use your Snapchat, because the cool thing about Snapchat is that it could be a nice, fun, and informal way for you to do like the same activity I talked about for Instagram and Facebook, except for like it could be super cool, right? Maybe you want to put a filter on it. Maybe you want to like tell a whole story with it, right? You can use pictures that you have saved. You can use a combination of pictures you have saved on your phone, and just like real live, just sitting there with your phone recording like, hey guys, a couple months, I'm gonna be done with grad school. It's been real. I learned about this, I did some of that, and now I'm trying to figure out next steps. What are your suggestions, right? Make people send you messages, right? Tell people that you wanna reach out. And it could be a fun thing. So like when you think about networking, it doesn't always have to be stuffy and serious. It can also be fun if you are. I'll save LinkedIn for last because I think it's a misunderstood tool. But YouTube, same situations, right? Like, how do you use YouTube as a tool? Depending on the industry that you're in, um, there's lots of crazy stuff on YouTube, but does the company that you want to work for, does the institution you might want to go and study at next, do they have a YouTube channel, right? Go and look and see who has been on there. Go and look and see what comments have been made. You might discover someone you might want to reach out to. I know that they always say we live in this society where people are like, oh, don't read the comments. But on some things, yes, you should read the comments because there are good people there. And depending on what you want to do, think about, is there a YouTube video that you should be making? Is there a how-to that you should be making? Is there something like, think about how do you create content? Because at this point, content is king, right? And so what is there, think about, similar to the podcast, is there a YouTube, series that you should be making? Be creative in your thoughts. Lastly, LinkedIn is, the Rolodex to the world. I encourage people to not make sure that you're being active on LinkedIn. Having a LinkedIn account is not being active on LinkedIn. Being active on LinkedIn, examples of being active on LinkedIn is that you're commenting, right? And that you're commenting on things, that you're posting content for yourself, number one. And you know what? If you're watching this and you're not posting on LinkedIn at least once a week, that is your homework assignment. You need to be posting something on LinkedIn at least once a week. Even if it's a reshare, you gotta post something on LinkedIn once a week, period. Not even gonna talk about that anymore. So that's one part of it. Commenting on things that other people have shared, right? Engaging in dialogue, right? In healthy, positive dialogue. And there is a lot of that on LinkedIn, right? About a topic area that you're interested in. That is another way of like being active and hopefully getting to know people. So you're posting, you're commenting, and you're using the publish feature, right? You can post your own things that you write on LinkedIn, and those things get tons of traffic if it's about something that's current and relevant. I love to use that feature because one, I don't have to necessarily shop around the piece that I've written and hope that someone takes it. Nope, power's in my hand, I can publish it myself. The second thing is that in addition to publishing it yourself, you can always write something cool that could lead to, you can write something cool at the bottom that sort of like uh, can lead people to invite you to comment more, which is what I do at the end of most of the published pieces that I do on LinkedIn. I say, these were my thoughts about it. What do you think? What would you have done in this situation to spark dialogue? Because you want to be a place where people can have that. So like use that publish feature. And then I also think that it gives people a good opportunity to, like, if they're just trying, if they're like come across your LinkedIn page and they want to know more about you, having things that you've written and published gives people a better insight into you and how you're thinking and what you're thinking about. It also then gives you a way to refer people back to that, right? So a lot of times we get so caught up in like, oh, I have to be published in this place or that place. Nope, you can publish yourself and then refer back to that and refer people back to what you've already written and use it as a reference. So those are some of the things. I also tell folks about LinkedIn. There are groups on LinkedIn that, you know, you can't spend like 8 hours a day on there. But if you're part of a group, an alumni group or professional development group, or, you know, I'm a part of one group on LinkedIn called Men of Color in Communications. And I always check that group page maybe at least once a week. Because it's an interesting place where people will post job openings, they'll post articles that I'm interested in, and they'll post webinars that are going on, and people have, again, constructive dialogue because they know sort of like that's what that space is for, and I've been able to meet people through having those conversations. And the other thing is, you know, LinkedIn is a place where we know people are looking. And so just make sure that, again, this is the basic one, making sure that your LinkedIn page is up to date and you're using the language of where you want to go. Say that again. You're using the language of where you want to go, not just using the language of where you are. And I think that's another thing that folks can use LinkedIn for. If you're trying to figure out how do you articulate this thing that you want to be or better articulate, go through LinkedIn and see how the people who are in the positions that you want to be in or further, like what language are they using and does that mirror the language that you're using, right? So those are some helpful things to think about with LinkedIn, about how to present yourself in a way that makes people want to come and talk to you, but also how are you using those tools to reach out and get to know folks too. A word about virtual coffees. Right? So virtual coffees are still a thing. They're definitely happening, and I hope that you're scheduling them. Virtual check-ins with folks, especially now that like you don't have to be in the same city to be like, hey, can we grab coffee? Nope, we can do it via Zoom. You could be 2,000 miles away. We can still have coffee. Don't forget, like, the same things that apply in like when you're talking to people in real life, a lot of that applies in this virtual space too. That like your nonverbals are super important and they say more than what you're going to say with your mouth. All right. So making sure that you're like, once you've reached out to someone or decide you're going to reach out to someone, that you've done additional research on them, you've Googled them, you read a couple things about them, you know who you're talking to. Something I will say, even also, if you're going to do a virtual coffee or call with someone who lives in another city, in addition to reading about them and sort of the work that they've done, bonus points for you if you go and look at their hometown newspaper, right? Before you talk to them, in case you want to talk about something topical, right? So you know what's going on where they are. That is just helpful and sometimes provides context, right? And sometimes it'll just give you something extra to talk about when you're like, oh, I don't know what I'm going to say. Dress appropriately, be early or on time, make eye contact as much as you can, even through the phone. Like even when you're watching TV, if you watched the debates last night, you could still notice that like one person was making eye contact with you. Make eye contact. Be aware of body language and expressions. Respect personal space. Don't be all up in the, right? That's still too close. Curate your background Today, I tried to give you my lovely background. This is my favorite one. I have about 2 or 3 places in my apartment that I like to sit. This is one of them. And when I can, I move flowers to the side. I want to give you an experience, right? I want the background to match what I'm talking about. And listen, verbals are important because how many times have we all heard, are you on mute? Can you hear me? Like, Scott, right. Because we're in these virtual environments, we have to be really thinking about, our pitch, our volume, and our tone when we're talking to folks, because people they got to pick up on that. The speed at which we're talking is also important. So, if you naturally talk fast, right, now you have to be extra conscious of making sure that you're slowing down, because things are easily either misinterpreted or just get glossed over if we're talking too fast. So your pitch, your volume, your tone, your speed. The other thing about virtual environments that I like is that people can't see everything that's in front of you. If you're talking to someone, you can use it on your phone, you can write some note cards, whatever it is, but you can make some talking points that you can keep, at the side of your laptop or on your desk, just so that you know that you're going to make sure that you say all the things that you want, the thoughts that you want to share with the person that you're getting out, the thoughts about you that you want this person, like the things that those top 2 or 3 things you want this person to know before they, leave your presence, that like you make sure you hit all your points, right? So think about using talking points. Okay, and then I think this might be my final slide, and I know I've talked a lot, probably almost over time, so Jeffrey, don't kill me. Reaching your full potential. So we talked about reaching in, about reaching out, and reaching your full potential. Okay, we're going to do these rapid fire things for you to think about. A and I, being authentic and intentional. Be authentic in how you present yourself, and be intentional when you are reaching out to folks, knowing why you're reaching out to them and what it is that you might want from them, and more importantly, what it is that you might want to share with them. Authentic and intentional. Relevance. It's important to be relevant right now, okay? Because no one wants to, we are in the middle of a global health pandemic. We are also in the middle of an economic crisis. We're in the midst of our nation reckoning with its history of systemic racism. There are a lot of things going on. So in your conversations with people about you and your work, how are you making what your background and what you want to bring to the table, how are you making it relevant? How are you making sure that you don't sound tone deaf? Make sure that you're part of the larger conversation that is already happening. How do you and your work fit into the larger conversation that makes it relevant? Referrals, right? So sometimes we talk to people, friends, family, professional folks, and they're like, oh, I don't think I can help you. Ask for a referral, right? So one of the things, I didn't talk about this, but in our, when we think about being systematic in our outreach, particularly with individuals, if you're gonna do it via email, a format that I like to use is like, hey, I'm 3 months from graduating grad school. I've been studying X, Y, and Z. Here are 3 things that I've done that are, that highlight my accomplishments. Here are the 3 things that I'm interested in doing. Are you open to talking to me about what you think future next steps can be? Or is there someone that you think I should talk to, right? Always ask for the referral, because that person might not be the person for you to talk to, but they might know someone, and they may not immediately think, oh, who can I mention this person to? But you got to do it. So ask for referrals, tell your story, work on telling your story, right? Because the more you tell your story, the better you get at it. And sometimes you are able to change the nuances. Understanding the story that you tell about yourself in April might need to be a little bit different or more nuanced when you're telling that story about yourself in November. But the more you do it, the more practice you get, the better, the easier it becomes. So that when someone tells, you meet someone new and they say, tell me about yourself, it's automatic, and you're not thinking like, what should I say? And you're not saying, you're just getting right to it. Skills over shininess, right? So sometimes when people are telling their story or talking about their background, they might feel that their experience is not as valued or valuable as someone, let's say, and we'll talk like tech industry, right? We'll say someone who they may not feel that their experience is as valuable as someone who might be working for Facebook or Google or Apple, some giant, right? Because they didn't work for some giant company. But the thing is, if you shined and used like really relevant skills at a small company, that's what the emphasis should be on. So like just because you didn't, intern or get published or do whatever this thing is that you're trying to do, at like one of the biggest think tanks or one of the biggest tech companies, that does not devalue your experience, right? Because it wasn't at the shiny place. You sharpened and honed your skills, and you want to emphasize that. So skills over shininess. Someone can work someplace really awesome but not do great work. Okay, clean the lens by which people view you, and which I'm talking about social media. You know, every now and then do a Google check on yourself and make sure that like there's not crazy stuff out there. Go through your social media, making sure that like those things represent you. Because when people reach out to me to have like, to connect, start building relationships, one of the first things that I do is I Google that person, right? Because I'm going to be like, is this somebody I want to be friends with? Is this someone I want to be connected to professionally? Let me find out. And if that lens ain't right, we not building no relationship. Um, be helpful to others, right? So it's not just about like, how do I make it? How do I network? It's not all about you, right? Collective communities. So if you meet someone along the way, you're like, I don't necessarily know that sort of your topic area or the jobs that you're sending me are good for me. Share those with other people in your network, right? Bring value to others, because that value will be later on brought back to you. Open eyes, open circle wide. So open eyes, those two things came at the same time, they shouldn't have. Open your eyes and open your circle, making sure that you're diversifying your circle. Everyone in your circle shouldn't look like you, shouldn't think like you, and necessarily shouldn't talk like you. Making sure you're reaching full potential, you got to talk to folks who are different, right? Volunteer, right? If there are opportunities, if you have the time, volunteering is still a great way to get to know people. And the great thing about volunteering and then meeting someone in a volunteer capacity is that you also know a little bit more about their values. You know that they value the same type of things that you do because they're there, right? And that's super important. Be committed to your growth. Goes without saying. Keep pushing, be committed to your own growth, because you're not going to meet your full potential by accident or mistake. You're not going to build healthy, strong, lasting personal and professional relationships just because. You have to be thinking about it. You have to be solid. You have to be systematic. You have to be committed to the process. You don't become best friends overnight. You don't, develop the world's greatest mentor-mentee relationship overnight. Those are things that you have to put work in. And so you be committed to your growth. Homework assignments. Hopefully you already figured out some for yourself, but here are some that I want you to remember. Define what it is that you want. Map out people and places who might be able to help to get you there. And then turn your plan into action. And just read, listen, and share. Don't keep everything in for yourself. Read, listen, and share. Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
All right. Well, thank you, Clarence. What a great workshop. Just yes, full of knowledge and tips. And Clarence, if you have not been able to, probably not, because you've been doing a great workshop. Seeing the chat has been full since you started, of questions and things that they were interested in learning about that you have covered, many and most of them. I know that we are out of time, but I want to give the opportunity, if you guys aren't jumping off to your next thing, if you want to introduce yourself and ask any questions directly to Clarence, if you have the time, please feel free.
Yeah. And I see some questions in the chat that I could answer too if people have time. Is that okay?
Awesome.
Okay. So one question I see in the chat, Maria said, how to network for different personality styles, introverts. Hopefully that's something that you got out of the presentation already, right? Is that particularly right now, you can use the power of not having to go out and talk to people per se, but how do you use written communication? How to use social media platforms to connect so you don't have to necessarily do the dirty work of like having to go talk to people in person. And so use your emails, use your comment section on your LinkedIn, use those ways to talk to people in a way that you probably are maybe more comfortable in doing. Autumn said, how to network without sounding cheesy or feeling fake or like I'm doing too much. Be authentic, right? Is to be authentic. That I think that's how you do it without being cheesy or feeling fake. And like I said in that one slide, A and I, authentic and intentional. Being yourself, because the other thing is you don't need to necessarily have 300 relationships, right? It's not about quantity, it's about quality. And so like some people, some person can be like, I'm well networked because I know 3,000 people, right? But you can be well networked with knowing three or 30 good people that you connect with and value in a real way. So don't think of like you have to have like oodles and oodles of people that you think are fake. Like don't even talk to people that you think are fake because they probably are and they don't mesh with you. And so, let your values shine through. I think values is really important. So yeah, like if somebody seems not cool and that you wouldn't want to talk to them in real life, don't talk to them. And vice versa, like just no. So keep it cute or put it on mute. And then Maria said, I'm also interested how to effectively articulate who we are and how to balance between being humble and the need to sell yourself. I am not a fan of cancel culture, Maria, but selling yourself, I'm canceling that, right? Because you're not selling yourself, you're talking about who you are and what you've done, right? And we're not going to minimize all the great things that you know and have done in your life. And we're not putting you into like, we're not going to try to shrink you to make somebody else feel better. So you're not selling yourself, you're just being who you are, an awesome academic. So that's my response to that. When I reach out to people on LinkedIn, even when I personalize the messages and I'm not asking for jobs, most of them don't get answered. How can I improve my approach? That is a really great question. So I think that, well, a couple of things about that. One, we can't control if people respond or not, because some people are on LinkedIn sort of like on Tinder, they're just being match collectors. They don't have intentions of really using it as a platform to connect, right? And so same thing on Tinder, like you match with somebody, they don't respond back to you, you're just like, oh, but I wanted to go on a date. And that, like you can't control that. What you can do though is really focus and emphasize your attention on the people who have responded. So like that's one part of that. Some folks on LinkedIn are just there to connect so they can say they have tons of connections, but in the long term, that's not helpful for to them because if you don't talk to your connections, you're not able to leverage them, right? So that's a whole nother story. So that's one thing. Focus mostly on the people who do respond. Another thing about your approach, I'll invite you to think about the language you use when you're introducing yourself to folks on LinkedIn. Are you ending it by saying, I'm looking forward to getting to learn more about you? Are you using language that says something to the effect of, let me know how I can be helpful to you in the future? Like, are you inviting them in? How are you inviting them into conversation, or how are you signifying to them that you want to be helpful to them too. So those are a couple of tips on doing that. See if you're not doing that, try that and see sort of what kind of response you get. And the other thing, yeah, I'll leave it at that because I want to get to the other question too. I really struggle with articulating what I do. I can't quite find the balance of how much background to give so that someone understands the importance of what I study. That is a great question to ask. So a couple of things that I'll encourage you to do is, in addition to sort of practicing in the mirror, right? I would invite you to find 2 or 3 people who don't know anything, who are not subject matter experts on the thing that you do, right? And say, hey, I want to practice talking about myself to you. And then asking them for their honest and real critical feedback. And so find people that you trust who are going to be honest and tell you, because they might be able to give you some tips. The other thing is that I'll invite you to think about, when you're saying that balance of how much background to give so that someone understands the importance of what I study. Can you say it in a tweet, right? Ask yourself the core nugget of why you do is so important. Can you say it in a tweet? Because folks need bite size. So 1, practice with some people who don't really know that much about what you're doing, lay people, right? And ask them, to help you break it down to how do you make it more understandable. And then for the compelling piece, figure out how do you say why what you do is so important? How would you put that in a tweet, right? I know you can do it, right? Fresno, I live there. Oh, Fresno. I've heard the slides, and then I think you join us. Okay, so I think I answered the questions that came up. I'm not sure if there are any more, but I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for spending all this time with me today.
Yeah, before we wrap up, are there any other questions? Would anybody like to ask before we close out?
So you sound a lot like my best friend, Nicole. And we had to have a coaching session last year when I went home for Christmas. Like, hey, girl, we got to work on this. So yes, that is part of the reaching in piece, is like really having a real honest conversation with you about like why you don't want attention on you. And really being honest with yourself, like, why don't I want attention on me? Getting to the root of that. And the other thing is, I would invite you to have a transparent conversation about, if you can't get past that, the same thing I told Nicole is, do you think your work is important? Right? Because some of this isn't necessarily about, like, particularly when you're posting certain things, it's not necessarily always about you. Really, it's about the work. And so you're doing this work because you think it's important and you think that it needs to be done, and probably other people aren't doing it, right? You can't move the needle on that if people don't know about it. You're not going to be able to move the needle and get more support to help that movement for the work that you're doing unless people know. So if you are super uncomfortable and you don't want to feel like, oh, I'm talking about me, then I would say, as the first step, start talking about that topic or that issue. Start talking about the work, right? Post about the work. But I still want you, like, I'm gonna let you slide with that one for right now. Like, okay, post about the work. But I want you to take a deep dive and reach in and figure, like, why don't I like talking about myself? Because you're awesome, right? And you're doing the work. And why shouldn't you get credit for that?
Thank y'all. We will give you back your time and have a great rest of the day.